What it fundamentally adds up to is the sacrifice of white working class girls at the altar of political correctness and, at the altar of the ideology of multiculturalism. We now know that we live in a country that is governed by people who would rather protect their own ideologies and their own reputations rather than protect certain girls from abuse and rape.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm James Heale and I'm joined today by Brendan O'Neill, Chief Political Writer at Spiked and a regular on Coffee House. Brendan, welcome to the show. This week, the headlines have been dominated by the fact that Jess Phillips, who's a minister in the Home Office, has rejected Oldham Council's call for an inquiry into the shocking abuse that went on there and in other towns across the UK. Explain how this issue is now blown up once again in the headlines, many cases 10 years after the first headlines were reported.
Yeah, it's a huge issue this week, largely down to Jess Phillips rejecting the idea of a government-led inquiry into the Oldham abuse scandal. But it's been brewing on Twitter, or X as we call it now, for quite some time. It's been gathering pace for a few weeks, for a few months. I think GB News and particularly Charlie Peters has helped to propel it into the limelight once again. So it's kind of come back as a huge story. I do think there's a tiny bit of historical erasure going on. You know, lots of people are saying, why has the media never covered this before? But the media has covered this. I mean, the Times was on top of this story for years and years, going back almost 20 years, I think. I know you guys at The Spectator have covered it and we've covered it at Spiked. So it's not entirely true that the media ignored it. Of course, sections of the media did. So the story has been out there for some time, but I think it's good that it's come back and we might finally have a reckoning with this scandal.
So why do you think really it blew up then? Obviously, there was the news hook about Jess Phillips rejecting that call by Oldham, and social media has played a part. But do you think there's other reasons why we're now revisiting this shocking scandal years after it happened, when it seemed for a while at least many politicians were keen to downplay it or not mention it at all?
You know, a lot of people seem to be hearing about it for the first time, which is not their fault. You know, maybe these people don't read certain newspapers or they just were not up to speed with what was happening in these various towns and cities across England. And they are understandably shocked. I mean, people are sharing some of the grim details from the court proceedings, which are really horrible and quite graphic. People are discovering the number of girls who were abused and groomed and raped. They're discovering, sometimes for the first time, the fact that local councils didn't want to talk about this issue, didn't want to mention the background of the perpetrators, didn't really seem to care about the white working class girls who made up most of the victims. So they're discovering some of this stuff for the first time, and that's understandably causing a lot of shock. People are shocked that something of this scale could happen in 21st century Britain, and I think they're right to be shocked by that. It is a very shocking story. I think what it fundamentally adds up to is the sacrifice of white working class girls at the altar of political correctness and at the altar of the ideology of multiculturalism. We now know that we live in a country that is governed by people who would rather protect their own ideologies and their own reputations rather than protect certain girls from abuse and rape. That is a very shocking thing to realize, and I think that's going to give rise to a lot more hand-wringing and a lot more desire for a true reckoning with how this was able to happen.
Can you talk us through some of the history of how these stories have developed? Because you have been writing about it a long time. Obviously, it was about a decade or so ago, more than a decade ago, that many of these accounts, which are now being shared on social media, were sort of put out there in some of the reports into things like Rotherham and the scandal there, the inquiry that dealt with that. Could you just talk us through kind of how the historiography of all this has unfolded over the past decade?
Yeah, so bit by bit, it's come out over the past decade and more, in fact. I was looking at some of the old stuff that I've written about it, and I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal more than 10 years ago about some of this stuff. So it really has been out there for quite some time. Rotherham was one of the first stories. There was Oldham as well. There's other situations in Manchester, in Telford, in Oxford, in various different parts of the country. There seems to have been this system whereby men of largely Pakistani Muslim origin were exploiting and abusing girls primarily from the white working class. This very warped dynamic seems to have taken place within certain communities, a dynamic of opportunism, sexual exploitation, abuse, really quite horrific stuff. But what really turns it into a huge scandal, I think, is the fact that officialdom didn't want to deal with it. They didn't want to be honest with the public about what was happening here. They thought that we would all go crazy and turn into Islamophobes overnight if we heard the truth. That's how little they trust us. That's how much they see us essentially as a mob in waiting who can't handle reality, who can't handle the truth, and therefore we have to be lied to, essentially. And I think it was driven by, firstly, this worry about upsetting race relations, this idea that if they told us the truth about what was happening in some of these towns, then race relations would collapse. But also by a kind of classism, just by this extraordinary disregard for the well-being and the safety of girls from a certain part of the country, of girls who are looked upon as, by some people, as chavs, as worthless, as white trash. I mean, that essentially is what drove some of the reluctance to deal with this problem as and when it was emerging. And that's also what drove, I think, the left's reluctance to talk about this issue, because they didn't want to be seen to be stirring up so-called Islamophobia, and they seem to have very little care for the well-being and the health of white working class girls. So it was a combination of moral cowardice, racial fears, and classism, which allowed this to explode in the way that it did.
And you say officialdom there. Talk us through how that manifested itself in terms of the alleged institutional complicity of people like local politicians, local services, and to an extent the police as well.
Yeah, so numerous reports have now found that there was a reluctance at the highest points of local councils and even in police forces to get to grips with this problem or even to take it seriously. And there are some really shocking accounts of girls going to the cops or going to local officials and asking for help and not being taken seriously. There was one case of a girl who went to the police and said that she'd been raped, and they thought she was drunk. They thought she was talking nonsense. They sent her away and she carried on being raped. I mean, that's the level of horror that we're dealing with. That's the level of official incompetence and failure that we are talking about. And there are many such instances where even when girls asked for help, they were not taken as seriously as they should have been, and they were often sent back into the arms of their abusers. So a lot of that was happening in different parts of the country, and it manifested itself in just this growing unwillingness to tackle the extreme nature of this problem. And I think what it really points to is a culture of moral cowardice in these institutions and a culture of a real sense of dread about ordinary people. This idea that we are so unpredictable and volatile and low information and stupid that we can't be reasoned with. We can't be told the truth about what is happening in our own communities. We can't be trusted to deal with that information in a rational, grown-up way. You know, censorship is always driven by a belief that ordinary people are too dumb to be able to talk about serious issues. And that's what happened in this case. There was this real dread that ordinary people would go mad if they knew the truth, and so it was hidden away from us for a long period of time. The consequence of that is firstly that we didn't have the free, frank, open discussions we should have been having, but even worse, the worst consequence is that girls were carrying on being abused and raped because officialdom refused to talk about it openly.
And I think coming across from this conversation is that famous phrase about the soft bigotry of low expectations. Frankly, as you say, the incentives weren't there for officialdom to act. No one, frankly, cared about what these white working class girls in many areas, as you put it, who were regarded by some as so-called white trash. No one cared about them and their fates. I just wonder, sort of 10 years on from writing a lot about this, do you think that has sort of changed in any way? Or do you think that the problems do exist, it's just they're yet tragically to be exposed once again?
I think it might change now because this story has come back in a huge way and it's been pushed by even by people like Elon Musk. I think he's pushing it in a slightly cack-handed way, I have to say. And the idea that Jess Phillips should be sent to prison just because she doesn't want an inquiry, I mean, that's real extreme talk from Elon Musk, and I don't agree with any of that. He doesn't seem to grasp the complexities and the nuances of this discussion, and also the fact that we have been having this discussion for quite a long time. I don't think we need Elon Musk to ride in on his white horse and save Britain from itself. I think we can do that ourselves if we take ourselves seriously enough. So I do think something will change. I think the discussion is now so widespread that there will have to be some reckoning with what happened. But the problem is that there is so much at stake in this, and so many people were complicit in the failures, and so many people were complicit in the abuse of some of the most vulnerable girls in our society. And by those people, I mean local councils, police forces, the political class, sections of the media, feminists, for example. I know one always risks getting in hot water when one criticizes feminism, but we do have a two-tier feminism system. And if you think back to the Me Too years, when I remember there were front page stories about politicians putting their hands on the knees of middle class journalists. I mean, that really was on the front pages, while the abuse and grooming and rape of white working class girls was very often not talked about at all. So there was an extraordinary double standard, even in what kind of victimization feminists were willing to talk about. So a problem we face is that a lot of people have failed massively on this issue. And the question is, do they have the moral guts right now? Do they have the moral bandwidth to face up to their own failures in order that Britain might become a better country once it's had a reckoning with this scandal? And that, I think, is what remains to be seen.
So would you, for instance, think it's the right solution to have this kind of inquiry in Oldham and potentially have a national inquiry as well? I know we've had the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, but that dealt less with, say, Rotherham, which is only mentioned once in that report, and dealt with other aspects of the care system. Do you think that there's time for that kind of national inquiry? And I suppose, how far would you go in terms of giving resources to that, given, of course, let's face it, inquiries often are not the way to see the kind of quick change we need to help those communities which are currently suffering?
Yeah, I'm a bit of an inquiry skeptic, I have to say. I think inquiries are often sometimes they're about putting a lid on things rather than really exposing all the problems and all the issues. And it's often a way for officialdom to cover its back or to say, oh, we're sorry, we won't do it again. It's not really the level of reckoning I think we need to have with a scandal of this scale. So I'm a bit skeptical. I'm not completely opposed to having a national inquiry because that would at least generate a public discussion as well as that kind of expert discussion. But I think going forward, we just need to make sure that we continue talking about this issue, that we have as wide and as democratic a discussion about it as possible, and that all facets of the failures that were committed are talked about and exposed. And really, the disinfectant of sunlight needs to be shone on all the institutions that fail these vulnerable girls in our society. I think it ought to be a wake-up call for 21st century Britain that we put ideological concerns above the safety of white working class girls. And it's not racist to say that. It's not Islamophobic. It's not bigoted. And in fact, if we really do want to live in a diverse, pluralistic society, which I'm quite keen to do, then we have to be very honest about these problems that exist in certain communities. So the only way we can guarantee social peace, open discussion, and the safety of all girls and women, including working class girls and women, is if we have a serious period of reflection about what went wrong and make sure that nothing like this ever happens again.
Brendan O'Neill, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, James.